Hi folks, my name's Gheeotine, and welcome to this week's Build Showcase, where for this week I'm going to be delving into a bit of a tangent related to my recent quest to find a laptop that would be considered my ideal that has a physical media drive. Not a lot of things have this anymore. There's been some updates in progress on my quest, but that'll be a future video. Instead, I became curious about a specific avenue of PC building related to this. I have the specs and approximate performance of the gaming laptop I used last time around, but I wanted to know if I could build a gaming desktop with equal to better specs for less. With that in mind, I began to search for parts. First things first, I looked for a CPU with relatively equal performance. For reference, the laptop uses an i7-7700HQ CPU. With that info, one might think, okay, so we just need the desktop CPU that says i7-7700, right? Not so fast. Just because they share some numbering similarities doesn't mean they are the same thing as far as performance metrics are concerned. Laptop chips are usually made to be more efficient and draw lower power loads to stay cooler, and usually clock lower as well. If we're looking for an equivalent CPU, we're going to need to look at the individual stats for the 7700HQ. That being said, what are we looking for? Well, the 7700HQ has 4 cores with hyperthreading, has a base frequency of 2.8 GHz, turbos up to 3.8 GHz, and has a 6 MB cache with a transfer speed of 8 gigatransfers per second. You don't necessarily need to know what all that means. You just need to have those stats in mind to find a match. So what did we find that can compete with that? Well, while not a stat-for-stat complete match, one of the desktop chips that came the closest was the i7-3770, a 3rd-gen Intel Core LGA 1155 processor, also with 4 hyperthreading cores. Its base frequency is 3.4 GHz versus the 2.8 from before, but the turbo frequency is only 0.1 GHz faster. It has 2 MB more cache, but that gets countered by a slower bus speed with only 5 gigatransfers per second as opposed to 8. So, tit for tat, these processors are fairly comparable. In most recorded benchmark readouts I could find, they often come within about 8% of each other, with each one edging out a lead depending on the specific tasks and metrics. So now we have our first part to determine the rest of the build. Searching for a compatible motherboard, I stumbled across this example of the latest in a series of janky Chinese motherboards using parts and components that the chipsets never originally supported. In this case, an LGA 1155 motherboard with NVMe support. For reference, NVMe drives weren't universally supported until about 3 or 4 generations of Intel Core processor later. Whatever, motherboard chosen, moving on. To further clone the laptop, 16 gigs of RAM and a 500GB NVMe storage drive round out the foundation of the build. Next up is the graphics card. The laptop doesn't explicitly differentiate as to whether this is using a mobile variant of the chip, so we're using a GTX 1050 with 2GB of VRAM. Not exactly a powerhouse of a card, but surprisingly usable in some games, and it requires no external power cables, so the power supply doesn't need to be all that special. Speaking of which, I got this small form factor 500-watt power supply from Amazon. Why small form factor? Well, so I could fit the DVD drive. That drive then fits perfectly into this cheap-ass case which, for the eagle-eyed viewers, yes, it's the Doubler's original case, complete with the 140mm giant f***-off fan mounted to the front. So if this thing overheats, I don't know what to tell you. Also, the handle is nice for portability since we're building a laptop competitor. So at last, with all the parts assembled, let's look at the finished laptop clone. Hell yeah, that's a laptop. With the machine built, we can now move on to testing the performance in games. The 5 titles from last time were the Cyberpunk Bench Test, Cult of the Lamb, Team Fortress 2, Wreckfest, and Crysis Remastered. So let's dive in, recalling the stats from last time around, and see if the gaming desktop outperforms. Starting with the Cyberpunk bench test, on low settings at 1080p, we were coming in with about 30 FPS as an average, and a 20 FPS low on the laptop. On the desktop, though, we are already seeing improvements. Maybe not enough to justify the 1080p resolution, but the low and average both went up by about 5 FPS. Not astounding, but when taking into account that this is a budget machine competing with an all-in-one device, every frame we can get is worth it. But if you recall, in the original laptop video, we also lowered the resolution down to 1280 by 768 and saw a 50% FPS improvement. Well, that scaling carried over on our little clone desktop. And let's not forget, 720p is technically high definition, so you can theoretically get a playable experience out of Cyberpunk on a 3rd-gen i7 and a 2GB GTX 1050 on a high definition. As for Cult of the Lamb, the prior laptop stats in the village had lows in the mid-30s, but hovered around 75 for the average. This one swaps the advantage clearly towards the laptop. Maybe it's the more efficient architecture of the device, or maybe my village has just gotten more populated since I was playing on the laptop, but while the lows were the same, the average took a hit, going down to about 50 FPS. Fortunately, clarity was achieved on the Crusade levels, and the whole reason for the dip in performance was because I had more worshippers putting load on the system. The combat and exploration were almost identical, with frame rate lows around 40 and the average in the mid-80s when striking and dodging around your foes. With the settlement, I guess it's fair to say that the more that worship you, the more work you have to put back in, I guess. If you care for car metaphors, Wreckfest seemed to have a bit of engine trouble. It could be a difference of map and the number of opponents, but starting the race in the back of the pack, 25 FPS was what we opened up with on 1080p, when the laptop had us opening around 35. Once we got out in front, we seemed to settle around 45, and sometimes our highs got just about to 60 FPS, but as a reminder, 55 to 60 was our average last time around. However, for the sake of achieving a far more playable frame rate, I knocked all the settings down to medium, and everything became all that much smoother and playable. And honestly, I couldn't notice all that much of a visual difference. Team Fortress 2 continues to impress with how well it handles slightly older and lower-end hardware, and if it's playable on a 1st-gen i5 with a GT 1030, then we are absolutely playable with a 3rd-gen i7 and a GTX 1050. To compare with the laptop, before we had 80 FPS lows and a 100 FPS average. Both these figures saw about a 20% uplift on the Doppelganger desktop, even when the action was getting hectic with all manner of explosives and crit particle effects going off around me. Unrelatedly, I wonder what would happen if you ran TF2 on a machine with the minimum specifications still on its Steam page. But finally, can it run Crysis Remastered? Well, on low settings, it pretty much matched the laptop, with lows around 60 and an average between 75 and 80. If the intention was to build an identically performing machine, these results seem to be well within the margin of error. But let's look at one last metric before we conclude for the day. At the start of the video, I wanted to see if you could build a comparable machine for less than the cost of the laptop. Pulling up receipts, the laptop cost about $300, including the charger, so that's the number we need to come under. What did our build run us? Starting with the parts I bought new, the motherboard cost me $43.45, the power supply and mounting adapter were $43.98, the case was $35.99, and the RAM came in at $27.98. Tallying the parts I got secondhand, the CPU was $24.90, the GPU was $28, and the 500GB NVMe was $24.99. Also, I suppose add $10 for the RGB controller for the side fan. The CPU cooler and fans were all salvaged from other builds and PC work that I've done. Adding up everything, we get a grand total of $239.29. Just about $60 cheaper than the laptop. Even accounting for a screen, mouse, and keyboard, you could probably still come in under the wire if you're willing to indulge in local marketplaces. I guess the lesson of this video is, don't settle for a laptop because you think it's cheaper and can get you into gaming. Put in the work, find the right parts, and don't be afraid of older generations of hardware, and you can make yourself a beautiful entry point for PC gaming. Plus, still have options for upgrading. Now, if you have space constraints, or if you need the portability of a laptop, yeah, that's a perfectly viable option. But don't think you need to lock yourself into that just because you think it might be a better deal. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a laptop upgrade video to contemplate. Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. Remember that I give away Steam keys with my regular weekly uploads, and all you have to do to enter is leave a comment and have contact info on your YouTube profile. But as always, thanks for watching and keep your head on your shoulders.